Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to the show. And I am so thrilled to have an esteemed guest with us. This is the great Professor Joshua Rifkin. He is a great performer, conductor, and scholar. And he's here today to talk about his career, essentially, and to give a lot of wisdom and experience and the things that he's really worked on over his career that I think will be very insightful and illuminating for my audience. So, Professor Rifkin, welcome to the show.
Well, many, many thanks. Do please call me Joshua. Professor has always seemed to me to describe somebody else.
Okay. Joshua, why don't we talk a little bit about your background? So, for my audience, you're well known for many things, actually, because you've really done so many things in your career. But why don't you give the audience a brief exposition on you and we will actually dive. We'll go chronologically. I'd love to talk about your early training, but
Sure.
give a little background on yourself.
Thank you. Well, I grew up in New York City, and I had the good luck to grow up there in a very rich musical time. And then I was, as usually happens, kind of like from a very, very, very early age, possessed by music. I just wanted to eat music, shall we say. And one thing, I had the usual lessons and training and this and that, and one thing sort of led to another. And particularly as I look back, seeing the rich time in which I was growing up, that kind of presented a whole bunch of possibilities before me and actually invited me into some of them. So, as we'll no doubt find out in more detail, many of the things I have done simply happened. And there I was and was able to grab hold of it.
Right, right. And how old were you when you first picked up the piano or whatever instrument you started with?
It was the piano, and I imagine I must have been 3 or 4. I
Okay.
heard recordings of classical music that my parents played, and of course, I went to the piano and tried to play back what I was hearing. I'm told that I could sing and carry a tune, or I was told, I was 2 or 3. I mean, the usual prodigy stuff.
Right.
Um, I suppose what was different in my case is that I had no ambitions whatever to be a pianist per se. I was much more interested in composing and in new music from really a very early age, and also in conducting. So they were the principal focuses with which, let's say, in which I began to pursue. But I did, of course, study the piano, and I suppose that came in useful later.
Right. And you went to the prestigious Juilliard school and you had some famous professors and you worked with some famous people. Can you just briefly talk about the training you received in Juilliard and what was memorable for you?
Well, I know this is a terrible thing to say, but Juilliard in those days was, despite its outward reputation, really not a terribly distinguished institution, at least in the concerns that I had. I came there as a composition student when I was 16 years old, and I was already very involved with new music and really what was then pretty advanced high modernism. I was
Mm.
um, uh, composing sort of total serialism and all of this kind of thing. And I got to Juilliard, and it was definitely not a place that was au courant with any of these things. I can still remember that when there was a reception for the new students, William Schumann, then the president of the school, met us and asked us what we did. And when he asked me what I did, and I said, "Oh, I'm a composer," and he said, "Well, what are you interested in?" I said, "Serial music." And he said, "Well, we'll try to broaden your horizons here." I regret to say that I did not have the presence of mind to say, "I hope not." But in any event, it was not, I'll have to say, a really stimulating musical environment, except for a few colleagues and one teacher to whom we'll no doubt come.
Mm.
But for me, I am unable to say that Juilliard was a wonderful, enriching experience.
Well,
I
could
have
I
had
just
others, but we'll get to them.
Well,
Yeah.
could I just touch on that a little bit?
Sure.
Is that because it was too conservative, or it was too traditional in the sense that it was not keeping up with current musical trends of that period?
Those are very good questions. I'd say that it was that both are true, but I should clarify to say that although it was conservative, it wasn't conservative certainly in a way that I found very interesting. There's more than one way to be conservative. And although I suppose I inclined to radicalism uh, at the time, in some ways still always have, there are a lot of conservatives for whom I had a lot of regard, certainly in the musical field. But Juilliard was more, let's say, rather than conservative, complacent. And it
Mhm.
was not only not uh, aware of or alert to many recent developments, but it really was not interested in them at all.
Mm. Right, right. And this is a very fascinating thing. So
Hmm.
maybe we should talk about one name that really, because I bought his book, which is the great pedagogue, and also I just anecdotes I've read about him were that he was a really total musician. I can't remember who it was, but somebody said that, and I'm talking, of course, of Vincent Persichetti. As I remember an anecdote, somebody said that he would read music like a newspaper,
Yeah,
which I
yeah.
found really interesting. What? But so you studied with him? Is that
Yes, I
correct?
studied with him. I could almost say that I was assigned to him as my composition teacher, probably because nobody else would have me. In some ways, it's a miracle that they let me into the place. But Persichetti is one of two people at Juilliard, I'll come to the other, to whom, at least on the faculty, to whom I really owe an immense amount. He was a superb musician, as you say. He was a fabulously good pianist.
Mm,
He gave the premieres of many notable compositions, including, for example, Dalla Piccola's Quaderno Musicale di Anna Libera, one of the great 12-tone piano pieces of the post-war era. He was open-minded. He was, um, well, in New York terms, I'll have to say he was an utter mensch. He was responsive, he was friendly, he was supportive, and God only knows I needed someone on my side at Juilliard. He was very candid in saying that he didn't really understand what I was doing, at least from the
mm,
inside. But he did say always he liked the way my music sounded. He felt I knew what I was doing, and therefore he would give me free rein to pursue what I felt I needed to pursue. So, as I say, my debt to Persichetti is enormous. And let me, before even further questions, mention one more person whom you might not
yes.
have thought to bring up here. And that
Okay.
was a gentleman named Norman Lloyd. Norman Lloyd, I think, taught in the theory department. He is not a celebrated figure now, but he was someone who had, imagine, in the early 30s, ridden the rails to some extent, played as a movie accompanist to silent films and the like, had a wonderfully varied background. Uh, there he is, was an excellent musician. And again, someone who really fostered me, you could say, supported me. And again, it's to him and to Persichetti, as well as to a few of my student colleagues, that I really owe a great debt and that made the experience at all worthwhile.
Can I ask a question about that
Please.
period and the, I guess, this is an overused word, but zeitgeist.
Yes,
But kind
yes.
of, I get the sense that there was a drive for a new sound. There's a drive for some exploration, something post-tonal, and
Mhm.
there's a bit of a resurgence of traditionalism in recent years. But I wanted to ask you, what was the sense of the spirit of the time? Was there a feeling like we need something new because maybe we're just there's too much late romanticism, we're bored of it, we're sick of it?
Yeah.
And also, I'm curious, as a young precocious child, were did you listen to plenty of music and realize I need something new that's separate from all of this in the 70s or the 60s?
Yes. Well, again, very good questions. Let's see. I think the sense that one needed something new was already a generation before mine, the post war generation in Europe. Uh, Meanwhile, we've had a lot of study and documentation on this, really felt that things had just reached a terminal point. This is with a war right behind them, very understandable. And they had, in a sense, just to start from square one again. So you have this growth of a new kind of music represented in Italy by Luigi Nono and Bruno Maderna, who were much more important pioneers than was originally recognized. Stockhausen in Germany, Boulez in France, Karel Huifert, in Belgium, people who were very consciously seeking something that hadn't been there before. So this is starting in the late 40s. I'm coming into it in the mid 50s, let's say, where I'm an early teenager. I'm born in 1944, so we're talking about, I guess, the mid-late 50s. But I got wind of some of these things because I was writing music and interested in what was out there. So I started, as so many did, with Hindemith, let's say, and neoclassical Stravinsky and Russian period Stravinsky and so forth. But I got wind that there was this other stuff there. And I read about it, and I began getting scores of it and trying to listen to recordings. And it was terribly exciting. One thing that people don't, I think, now understand about this period, the high modernist serial period, is that it was almost like it was something very thrilling, very exciting. You could almost, I suppose, if you were negatively inclined, call it something of a cult, because there was an element of faith. We did believe in this in so many ways. But I was certainly taken up by it, very, very, very enthused by it. I remember getting into disputes with my composer colleagues, my student colleagues at Juilliard, for example. They included, by the way, slightly older than myself, Philip Glass and Steve Reich. And, when somebody did something that seemed atonal, saying, well, but, is it serial? Are you controlling it in those ways? And if they said no, I said, well, you're not doing it right, etc. I must have been pretty insufferable in those ways. But in any event, it is something that almost took possession of one. And so after my first year in Juilliard, in fact, I went during the summer over to Darmstadt, which was the sort of center of the European avant-garde, the so-called international vacation courses for new music, where I'd been admitted into Stockhausen's composition seminar, etc. So I was now absorbing it at the source. Was that 94? Yes, Stockhausen was considerably younger when I saw him. And he also, by the way, this gets ahead of things a bit, was an enormously compelling figure, I'll have to say. I'm hardly the only one who saw him that way, who responded to him that way. That's more like it. I was there in 61 for the first time. So it was just an exciting period. So much was happening. And a lot of it was happening or reflected in New York City. Stravinsky came to conduct there every year. You had other advanced composers, not the Europeans, but in a very different way, but still advanced. There was Milton Babbitt, there was Stefan Volpe, there was Edgard Varese, whom I came to know when I was a teenager, etc. So it was just incredibly lucky, to be there. It was wonderfully exciting. I lost the faith eventually, although I never felt that, I was a sort of dupe or anything like that. I think one evolved, but that's where I began, you can say.
Well, I want to ask you. I just want to stay on this a little bit because I was just trying to look for. I like. I was thinking of the Russian Five, and I remember in some sense they had a very strong identity, and they were pushing for something as well. And I was very tickled also by the way they described contemporary composers, such in the way that Mozart, Bach seemed petrified, or Chopin was a nervous society lady. They liked they liked
Yes,
Berlioz. They liked this person. They didn't like that person.
that's right.
So
Yeah.
in that period, then in the 50s and the
Yeah.
60s, what was if somebody played Mozart or Bach or
Mhm.
Chopin in your circle? How would that have gone down?
Ah, well, it would have gone down very well, actually, because,
Okay.
being devoted to the newest music did not mean that one rejected earlier music. In fact, I
Mm,
and I think most of my friends certainly were just again omnivorous for this. We were trying to get it all. So um, we tried to know all of Mozart, all of Bach, all of Beethoven, all of these people. Um, I mentioned going to Darmstadt when I was 17, but at the same time in Darmstadt, I took out subscriptions to the new complete editions of Bach and Mozart, the Neue Bach-Ausgabe, the
mm,
Neue Mozart-Ausgabe. We all saw no contradiction there. We felt even the European composers who were trying to start from square one also felt, in many ways, part of inheritors to the tradition.
mm,
The people who were not interesting were the people who just did not, in a sense, were complacent,
mm,
as I said before. So tonal music seemed, impossibly the wrong thing. Um, After all, even then, it was more than 50 years since the birth of atonality in
mm.
Vienna. That music was still new, still exciting. It shouldn't have been new still, but it's showing in a way how retrograde everything else was, that it was
Yeah.
considered still new. And of course, in some ways, it's a more complicated thing. And in some ways, it's never lost its newness. And in some ways, it remained new because people just couldn't quite get with it. But still, I'll say, whatever revisionism I may have come into in later years, it is the powerful music. It is the music that still, to me, is the most exciting of the 20th century. I
Mm,
mean, from that time onward and in that tradition. There were exceptions, of course. I mean, Stravinsky was always, Babbitt was very important, let's say,
and you studied with Milton Babbitt.
I studied though not composition. When later I went
Okay.
as a graduate student to Princeton, I took his theory classes, and it's true I spent more time in Milton's classes than I did in official musicology classes. And Babbitt was also one of these very, very magnetic, charismatic characters. I didn't love the music, but although I came to admire some of it, but that's another story. But yeah, he always certainly was very, very, very clear that it's not advanced versus conservative,
Mm,
uh, and he always, always, let's say, supported Stravinsky, and but. Uh, it still boiled down in many ways to quality. I mean, among conservative composers, I always, at least almost always, really loved Copland. I thought the music was wonderful and beautifully done, and so it didn't matter, if if it was all quote tonal unquote. Billy the Kid is a great piece, and always was. So I don't think any of us were closed off in those ways. There were some
yes.
people, of course, who were so in the avant-garde that they didn't really devote much time to the older music. But I know even colleagues in the John Cage circle, in the world of Fluxus, etc., where I also
Mm,
was, um, if you talked about this music to them, or if you raised it, you discovered they knew it. They had grown up with
mm,
it. They valued it. It's just not. It just wasn't their chief concern at the moment.
right. And I just had this is such a fascinating area. And just maybe the final question, which is, did you ever read accompanying philosophy in that period? Because were people trying to seek some kind of transcendence through this? Were they trying to, if I pursue this path, something will happen. I will perhaps find a level of understanding of reality that perhaps will go to the next level.
Um, As far as I can recall, I didn't. I may have been too siloed in on music. I mean, I did have other interests. Maybe I was influenced as much by cinema at the time, by politics, um, and other such stuff. Philosophy, I didn't really read, or I don't recall reading that kind of thing that had an important effect on me. I think it really came through the music and was really focused on it always one way or another.
So, what happened and then after that period in your career?
Yes. Well, a number of things happened. Let's see. First of all, I had I had a parallel existence, or even parallel existence, one might say, to the focus on writing this extremely abstruse new music that I'm sure nobody particularly wanted to hear. Um, for one thing, as I say, there was the connection to older music. I loved the standard repertory and I wanted to be engaged in it. I wanted to be performing it, particularly conducting it. And I also, from very early on, loved early music. I mean, so pre-Bach and Renaissance music and earlier Baroque music, I was very lucky that, for example, my piano teacher, one of the other people to whom I owed a lot, a now
Mm.
forgotten but really excellent musician named David Leibovitz, was also a choral conductor and introduced me to Bach cantatas and to Schütz. And so that helped bring me into that part of the world. And um, through another series of connections, I had become acquainted with early jazz and started playing it, and then became what was known in the day as a folkie. And I played the banjo down in Washington Square in New York City from the age of 13, 14. Um, so those things went on. And as it happens, they they actually contributed to the changes that took place subsequently in a number of ways. First of all, I got interested in music history. The early music interested me. And when I was about 16, I think, I learned, so I'm still just between high school and Juilliard. I learned that something earth shaking had taken place in
Mm.
work on Bach, that his works, most of which he had not dated. And dating is something that's one's interested in. When did so
Mm.
and so write this? What led to what, etc. It's a kind of old-fashioned concern, but I think still a sensible one. Um, the entire scaffolding, you might say, of Bach chronology had been radically overturned in the late 1950s, really in the years 1957 and
Oh,
58.
okay.
And I was stunned to read about this. And also, so I wanted to learn more. And then I started to learn
And
more about how it was done.
briefly, what was
Yes,
overturned? So, what was initially thought, and then what was the new
very good.
revelation?
Okay. Well, the greatest bulk of Bach's output is the vocal music, the cantatas, the oratorios, passions, etc. And most of them didn't have a dating. Now, in the 19th century, a very brilliant scholar named Philip Spitta was really perhaps the greatest Bach scholar. It's certainly a very, 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 very great scholar. Um, Wrote what had long been the definitive biography of
Mm.
Bach, a two-volume publication, came out in 1873 and 1880, I think. Um, and one of the things he grappled with was this problem of, okay, when did Bach write the music? And he came up with a brilliant tool for sort of figuring this out in the vocal works. He had an insight that really was pretty revolutionary, that you could identify papers through their watermarks. Um, and you could, for example, see that, let's say, this whole bunch of Bach cantatas, if we had the original scores, the original parts, there he is, um, you could say, well, these all had the same watermark in them. That is, they must have been done on the same batches of paper or same batch of paper, and thus they must be chronologically contiguous, or all but surely chronologically contiguous. And Spitta used this insight to erect this wonderful chronology of particularly the cantatas. And it was so brilliant, and he was so brilliant, that nobody dared question it, or when anybody had the temerity to do so, it always turned out that they hadn't thought through the matter well enough, and Spitta really was right about it all. However, for various reasons, in the early 50s, people started to go at this again. And in particular, two scholars in Germany by the name of Alfred Dürr and Georg von Dadelsen really sort of like went absolutely, right down to the bottom of this. And they had Spitta's tool of paper, but they were able to use it in a more sophisticated fashion. And they had something that he hadn't really used, and that was handwriting. They could trace the development of Bach's handwriting, and Bach, all through his life, relied on copyists, usually pupils, to, let's say, create parts of his pieces and, help him in all of this stuff. And Dürr and Dadelsen particularly sort of started to sort out all of these people who worked for him. And it turned out that Spitta had also made some very elemental mistakes, and also had been in some ways prejudiced and had kind of put his thumb on the scale at certain points so subtly that nobody really noticed it. I mean, Spitta, like any writer, was ideologically driven, even if he didn't know it. And in particular, he had an image of Bach as a Lutheran church composer. And this was also connected to certain German national ideals. I don't mean nationalistic in the bad sense, but certainly, Bach as German comes into this very much. Needn't go into detail, but it turned out later, if you looked at kind of a juncture in his chronology where the evidence was not really there, he kind of came up with a lovely, brilliant surmise that was rooted in these ideological bases. Well, now all of this was exploded. So whereas it was thought that Bach had composed cantatas throughout his time in Leipzig, and in particular composed one great group of cantatas, the so-called chorale cantatas, between 1735 and 1744. He composed virtually all his cantatas within 2 years of arriving at Leipzig in 1723.
Wow.
And the chorale cantatas were written 1724 to 1725, i.e. as much as 20 years earlier than anybody had thought. And that was an earthquake in Bach's studies. And I was lucky sort of to catch wind of this. And part of me was thinking, how did they do this? I want to know more about this. And what I discovered they
because maybe who else has been chronologically misdated?
Well, other people not as drastically, perhaps, but Mozart. There was a lot wrong with Mozart as we thought about it then. A lot wrong with Josquin des Prés, but that's more esoterical. That has occupied quite a bit of my life. Beethoven.
I want to ask you about that. Definitely, Josquin. That would be very interesting.
I'll look forward to that. But see, by about 1800, everything is getting dated. Composers put dates on most manuscripts and stuff is published. But the farther back you go, the less evidence you really have. But so that this could be done with Bach. And then, as I say, the way they did it, I mean, what is this? Paper? Handwriting, it sounded like mysteries, like secrets, And of course, when you're confronted with a secret, you want to know what it is. So that got me into that, and that got me interested in the musicological work, the historical work. At a certain point, I had gone to Juilliard. I graduated when I was 20, and I faced a choice, graduate studies or get drafted. This was the Vietnam era. Well, not only did I not want to get shot at and killed, but I really, like everyone I knew, was vociferously against the war at the time. I would not go into that, So I didn't go to Canada. I went to graduate school. That's what one did in those days, basically, to avoid the draft. And I did not feel that there was anybody in the US with whom I really wanted to study composition. So at that point, I made the decision to apply for musicology and study that. And I was accepted one or two places. And so that became the work that I was doing officially. And I kept composing, but gradually, I'll have to say that fell away largely because, as I mentioned, I lost my faith in serialism, but didn't arrive at something to replace it. I can still admire those colleagues of mine who did. I mean, in that way, yes, kudos to Philip or to Philip Glass or Steve Reich, or to my very dear friend in that era, still Paul Lansky and others who found a way to get out of this apparent cul-de-sac, but not fall back on neo-romanticism or something. But I couldn't go to the places, but I couldn't go to minimalism, and I couldn't go to neo-romanticism. I
Was there
couldn't.
a moment? Was there a moment in time that suddenly you had that epiphany?
Um, Probably not one moment, but if I look back, a few moments in a fairly concentrated period. And this gets me back to this other part of my life that I raised. Um, One of I suppose if there was an earthquake in Bach studies, the other earthquake was the Beatles and 60s pop. This amazing music that came out. I mean, I still remember the first time I heard the Beatles. I had heard of them. We had read stories, had heard the rumors. But when they appeared on the Ed Sullivan show in the States, and I heard this, and I mentioned Paul Lansky, very eminent composer now. We were closest friends at the time. And right after this is done, the phone rings and it's Paul calling, says, "Did you see that?" It just amazed us.
So
And
wait a second. So in a very high level of avant-garde composers, there is a discussion about the Beatles.
the Beatles knocked us all out. And every
Really?
avant-garde composer. Oh, absolutely. I mean, 60s pop in general was, 60s rock, 60s no longer Broadway adjacent pop, but this newer pop. It knocked us all out. And every composer, I mean, I remember speaking with members of the Cage Circle about this. All of my colleagues, all of my contemporaries at Princeton when I went there in 67 onwards. And the thing was, and I've written about this someplace, that was very subversive. Because how could this music that was created not by all the fearsomely learned characters who were creating the music to which we were
Mm.
devoted as modernists, um, and this music which was tonal, etc., 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 have something that we recognized as, you could almost say transcendent value. This just didn't fit, and it really changed the lives of a lot of people, one way or another. This is one of the secret histories to be written, but there is a group of highly gifted, high modernist composers who radically changed or even stopped composing. I don't know if I was one of the high modernists, highly gifted, but I wasn't. I wasn't bad either. But I was one of those who fell by the wayside in this, found it impossible really to continue where one was. So this
Mm.
also was a crisis of faith, you could say. And this happened, I would say, yeah, within a couple of years, in the mid to late
Can I
60s.
quickly just ask about Elvis? Because Elvis had a quite a similar sort of explosion, I guess, in the 50s.
Elvis didn't reach me or my circle. I mean, you're right about the impact of Elvis, and without Elvis, there would have been no Beatles, etc., etc. But most of us were still found it far, and in a way, almost beneath our dignity. Um, I mean, I can remember that, I spoke of the folk music scene. In 1963, again through a series of lucky accidents, I became a member of a jug band. And
What
we,
is a
in
jug
fact,
band?
a jug band was a small ensemble play in the mostly rural, no, in the well, rural and urban South in the 20s and 30s, largely African American, largely Black in origin. There you can see, I think that's Gus Cannon and his Jug Stompers, that played a blues and jazz inflected music, but
Mm,
on acoustic instrument, not on the jazz instruments, but as you see, banjo, guitar, and kazoo. And as a bass instrument, they often used, in fact, a jug, which was blown through the way one through with trumpet or trombone. You know? And so it was, again, through just a lucky accident that I wound up one evening doing this music. But that brought us to Elektra Records, and that brought me into the record business, which also then shaped a lot of my life. But at the time, in the jug band, really, we were also hardcore traditionalist folkies most of the time, which meant pop music was also not something we looked at. We even look at modern, folk music like the Kingston Trio or Peter,
right.
Paul, and Mary. Now, we wanted the real old, hard knuckle
So that
stuff.
was too polished and a little bit artificial.
You got it. There were exceptions. John Sebastian, who went on to found the Love and Spoonful and make a great career in pop, was a member of the group, and he knew rock and roll very well. But
How
he
did
was,
Bob Dylan fare in the
well,
circle?
Bob Dylan was okay as a folk. He was somewhat controversial. There were those who loved him, those who hated him. I regret to say I was one of the latter at the time, and I think, boy, was I ever mistaken. I didn't come to love Dylan until just a bit later when he went electric. And when I heard Dylan's electric music, I was absolutely blown away. But by that time, my life had in many ways changed.
Mm,
However, the relationship to pop music, and then it was the Beatles that really crystallized it. The Beatles made this music, among other things, respectable for intellectuals. Intellectuals in insofar, literary types and all of that, were interested in vernacular music. It was mostly jazz.
yes.
But now suddenly every English professor was writing about the Beatles. It suddenly it changed the whole paradigm, you
Mm,
might say.
right.
Insofar as, by the way, let's see, what used to be called high culture has been eclipsed for more demotic culture, pop culture,
Mm,
etc. In the halls of academe, any place you look, this is the period where that is happening, where that transition is taking place. And indeed, uh, it certainly all of us, but those whom I knew, um, were very affected by this and could not maintain, at least unquestioningly, all elements of the relationship to high culture that we'd once had.
mm. Um, so which came first? Your because you, like you mentioned, you were introduced to the recording career, and
Yeah,
you had quite a huge effect on culture in the 70s, an enormous effect. But then also in musicology, you had a very significant impact, because I want to talk about the historical numbers of singers in a chorus, because I think
sure.
if anyone goes to your Wikipedia page, they will say it was
Yeah.
controversial at the beginning, but it has gained quite an influence in
Yeah.
performance practice. So which came first, the Joplin or the chorus work?
No, very, very, very fair question. Let's see. Okay, just maybe chronology is useful here. As I say, in '63, so I'm 19 years old. I'm about to graduate Juilliard. No, in fact, I still have a year left at Juilliard. Um, I come into the jug band. By the way, also, you see in that year, I took part in the first performance of Satie's Vexation, the 18-hour piano piece that John Cage had arranged. So already I'm doing a number of kind of things that you wouldn't expect to come together. But I come into the record train, the record business. And by the mid 60s, in fact, I am doing my own recordings there. I've become a recording artist, you might say. So there is that connection. And then in, 1970, two things again happen. I leave Princeton, I take an academic job. And in a couple of years before that, I'd been introduced or reintroduced to ragtime and Scott Joplin. I'd known this music some since I had been maybe an adolescent or even pre-adolescent. I mentioned the early jazz connection, and there I came across some of Joplin. I played it, but of course in a very early jazzish manner with more improvisation, swung rhythms, etc., etc., etc. It was really another close friend of the period, the composer and critic Eric Salzman, now sadly no longer with us, who brought my attention to Joplin again, and with him, William Balcom, who is happily still with us. And Bill and I had come to know each other when I was a Juilliard student, and he was up in Yale, already a graduate composition student. But somehow our paths crossed, I think, through his first wife, who was at Juilliard. Whatever it is, this nexus brought me back to Joplin, and I became utterly there they are, Bill and Joan. Joan was not the right wife at the time, but they're both wonderful people. Bill, whom I sadly have not seen in many years, was again a very magnetic character, wonderful musician. And I became really just tremendously taken up with Joplin. And of course, there I was at a record company, and I was making records for them. So I was able to come to them somewhere roughly the spring of 1970 and say, we really ought to record this music, and I can get the pianist for you cheap. And and they agreed to do this, and to be very honest, I said we ought to do it, and we ought to do it on a classical record label and present it in a certain way, and this was, I think, very different. This is not the way Joplin or ragtime had been known and presented, and fortunately they liked the idea. They went along with it, and we put it out. I'm not exaggerating here. We put it out in the early autumn of 1970. I had just also moved from New York to the Boston area, where I now became an academic. And as we did with everything at Nonesuch in those days, we simply put it out on the market to die. Nonesuch did zero marketing, zero advertising. At most, they brought new records to people at radio stations. That was it. And to our astonishment, literally to our astonishment, people really started getting excited by this music.
It went viral, to use a modern parlance.
Yes, absolutely. I expected that it would sell a few more copies than my recordings of late 15th century French secular music, which I had done, and which sold a few hundred copies or something like that.
Can you remember the recording session? What was the recording session like? And did you use multiple sessions?
I remember it very vividly. Of course, we used multiple sessions. You had to do many takes of each piece. I worked with this wonderful production team of an engineer named Mark Obor, Aubort, and sort of producer, cum engineer Joanna Nikrens, who, among other things, she's now no longer with us, sadly. I love them both. I think Mark is gone, but I don't know. No, he could hardly be there. Mark J. Obor, Joanna Nikrens. Joanna's daughter, Erica Nikrens, is a very distinguished pianist. These were wonderful colleagues. Tracy Stern, of course, who was the head of Nonesuch at the time, and played obviously really the essential role in getting this done. We recorded in New York City at a church on the Upper West Side at Broadway and 72nd Street, which was a beautiful acoustic, did have the problem that subways ran underneath it. So we would get destroyed by subways. And these were the early days. It was still tape, but they had the Dolby noise reduction system newly introduced. And that meant that we didn't have tape hiss to cover up the subway rumble. So that was a technical challenge that we had to face. Nevertheless, we did it then. This was over the summer, just before I moved up to the Boston area. Mark and Joe were these wonderful producers. And at a certain time, I remember, I wrote liner notes. We insisted that there be a serious-looking cover, that there'd be some dignity to this.
Yes.
And as I say, then it appeared, and it took us all by surprise.
Well, it says here that it sold 100,000 copies in the first year and went to become the first million-selling album for Nonesuch.
I don't think in the first year it sold 100,000. If it sold 1 million eventually, that took quite a few years. I mean, I know I had the royalty statements, and certainly it benefited my financial status. But I can tell you that the earliest royalty statements may have been in the low 5 figures, nothing like 100,000 copies. In fact, I can remember that later, after I left Nonesuch and was recording for Decca in the UK, my producer there, who had been a producer in New York for a long time at CBS and whom I had gotten to know there, once said to me, if you'd recorded that for CBS, it would have sold 1 million. And I said to him at the time, yeah, but if I'd recorded that for CBS, I never would have recorded it. They wouldn't have done it.
Right.
Really, it took Nonesuch to do it. So, but yes, it did, whatever the exact figures. I suppose if I went back through all my royalty statements, I could add it up, but I've never felt inclined to do that. It certainly did well, and it spawned 2 successor albums.
So just really quickly before we go to the number of singers in a chorus, in January of 1971, Harold C. Schoenberg, very influential figure, wrote a nice article in the New York Times telling scholars, get busy on Scott Joplin. So how did you react? I mean, just in one moment, you're recording in a church, there's the subway going, you think, like you said, the record is going out to die, you're not expecting much. Then it's selling hundreds, thousands of copies, and now influential figures. What was the mood like at that time? What were you thinking?
I knew Harold Schoenberg, by the way. He was an acquaintance of my father, so we had known each other since I was an early teenager. I think, again, it was heady. He wasn't the only one. As I say, there really was this groundswell. Record magazines were right. I was being approached to do concerts, this and that. I should say, by the way, that this was also not in and of itself something new in this respect. Already the jug band had quite a success. In 1965, when I came to when I had already been at a record company, we did a recording of, it was called a Baroque Beatles book, that turned Beatles songs into authentic Baroque music, and that was a bestseller. Then, right in the wake of that, I had recorded as an arranger with Judy Collins, and we had gold record albums, and so and I was already known for this. So in a way, in those days, I was not unknown. So when the Joplin came, you could say it was more of the same, just pushing it to a different level. Just as, I'll get ahead slightly, in 1973, when the film The Sting was made.
I was just about to mention that, yes.
Well, just very quickly, I can say that George Roy Hill, the director of the film, in fact, asked me to do the music, but for various reasons, I did not. I didn't accept the offer, as it were. And as I said at the time, look, we had been numbers 1 and 2 on the classical charts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it was already, famous, celebrated, but this made it ridiculous. It pushed it to yet another level. But it's a terrible thing to say, but I was sort of accustomed to a measure of celebrity, fame. I mean, now maybe I'm totally obscure, but these were different times. That's a long time ago. So there you go.
Just to end the section on Scott Joplin, what are your top 3 of his compositions that are special to you?
Oh dear, that's very hard. That is hard to say because I love them all, and I love most the one I'm playing at the moment. I suppose I'd have to include. I won't say these are the top 3, but off the bat, I could name Solace.
Oh, Solace, yeah.
Magnetic Rag, and one I don't know which I'd come up with. Let's say there, and just about anything else. I mean, Scott Joplin is a wonderful composer.
He's a genius.
He is a genius, and this also had an influence on me. He wrote this really beautiful, exquisite music. And he is clearly a thinking musician. I mean, I love Joplin as a man, as a human being, even beyond him as a composer. It's both, So Joplin also, yes, he had a tremendous effect on my life. Now, so
what did you make of his? I have to include this. What did you make of? I talked to a scholar, Philip Terita from Germany, and he talked about Scott Joplin owning a copy of Salomon Yaddison's counterpoint treatise and was heavily annotated, apparently. So does that surprise you, or his training?
It does not. Joplin studied, he had some formal training, maybe not extensive, but he studied with, and I haven't checked the newer literature on this, but, an immigrant German music teacher in Sedalia, Missouri, where he was growing up. Texarkana. And then in Sedalia, he attended classes at a college for Black students and studied music there. He certainly is musically literate. He could read. He could clearly arrange. The choral writing in Tremonisha, for example, up to 8 voices, is immensely skillful. It doesn't just sound beautiful. It's written by somebody who really knows how to make the music sound and really knows how to engineer the notes on paper. So you're dealing with a musician of indeed considerable sophistication that he would have carefully studied counterpoint. Joplin is, in the best sense, an aspirational character, and he is always clearly pushing himself and learning. I mean, that's any artist is. The Beatles were, Mozart was, Beethoven was. You're always looking for more. You're always looking to go beyond. I mean, you may not even be consciously looking, even knowing that you're doing it, but that's what you're doing. And that's what Joplin did. So Joplin had an immense impact there. I will mention one last thing on Joplin, and that a few years ago, I was contacted by the very prestigious German music publisher, G. Henle. They're the people who put out the standard
the Urtext. Yes.
Urtext of Bach, Beethoven, Chopin, these very, very sober blue covers. And they have asked me if I would do an edition of Scott Joplin for them. I haven't yet come to do it. I hope that I'll be able to come to do it in the next couple of years. The last I knew, the project is still alive. And of course, I feel that as an obligation, and that would be a lovely way to, I still do play the music sometime, but also to round out, in a sense, my engagement with Joplin and really give back to him something. And the thought of Joplin in Henle's beautiful blue covers next to Beethoven and Chopin is immensely gratifying.
Yes.
Okay. So there you are in the 70s. At the same time, I'm
so you talked about chorus. That immediately put the image to mind of your very important work in this field. So
Yes.
it wasn't universal. It was controversial, but
No.
again, it was very influential, and a lot of people are compelled by it. So, what happened there? How did you come to that research, and
How do you
what's
come to that
happening?
exactly? Well, that's that. Yes, as I say, rounding out Joplin is indeed the pivot to that. But in fact, again, I'll go back just a little bit earlier. Um, Already in my late teens, I was very interested in questions of performance. In fact, that's one of the main reasons also that did musicological studies. I wanted to learn, well, how do you play Bach's trills properly? What are the tempos? How do you do this? How do you do that? Because one was very soon aware that that the recipes one had for playing Beethoven or Brahms or whatever were not necessarily all applicable here. So I was very interested in that, and quite early I started conducting Bach. I think I did my first Bach performance as a conductor when I was 17 or 18, one way or another. And I remember putting on cantatas in a Greenwich Village coffee shop with Juilliard colleagues when I was 18 or 19. So I was very interested in this, and there's a question that anybody who conducts Bach cantatas is going to face at a certain point. And put very dumbly, it's this. We all know that the arias are supposed to be sung by a single voice and that the choruses are sung by a chorus. But if you actually look at Bach's music, you find that there are a lot of movements that it's not clear who is to perform them. Pieces with
Mm.
three voices. And if you if you listen to recordings at the time, you'll find one recording had this sung by a chorus and another recording had it sung by three singers. And
Ah.
you can amplify these things. And of course, I wanted to know, well, which really was it? What's going on here? How do you choose? And the thing is that Bach didn't say anything about it. And if you look at, let's say, later scores, Beethoven, Missa Solemnis, it says clearly what's the chorus, what's the solo singers, but nothing of this in Bach. And how do you decide this? How do you do it? Okay, so that's one thing. This question is there with me as a very practical issue. Then there is something else that happened. There was at the time in Germany a conductor and musicologist by the name of Wilhelm Ehmann. Now, Ehmann was a man, as I did not know at the time, with a really horrible political past. This guy was an arch Nazi. I was not
Ooh.
aware of this at the time. He was a wonderful musician at the same time, one of these difficult cases that you have. And like many old Nazis, he'd managed to fetch up with a good position in post-war West Germany,
Hmm.
where he was the director of a church music school and conducted a choir and made recordings. And they're beautiful, by the way. You see, that's the terrible thing. And he had a theory that was, as I realized, not very well based. I didn't go into all the details, but that Bach performed certain sections of his choruses or choral movements with single voices. And this interested me too. Well, how did he know? How could you tell? And he made recordings like this. And even he was not the only one. The great American choral conductor, Robert Shaw, did a recording of the B minor Mass at this time that actually had many, many sections sung by single voices, not the full chorus. And I'll have to say that when I heard this, it sounded like magic to me. I thought,
Hmm.
this is wonderful. I love the
That
sound.
is correct. That's the correct word.
But at the same time, I said I knew that the research behind it was not really solid. That but clearly, some part of me always wanted to figure this out, and I think I had a prejudice towards towards single voices.
What was
Now,
the opinion at the time? Did people think that that was a crazy idea, or was that just do what you want, or just we don't know, so it's up for grabs?
I think they thought that it was a possibly attractive idea, but crazy in the sense of not really well founded. I mean, it had been examined critically by Alfred Dürr, the name that I mentioned before, who said, look, the evidence just doesn't support it. And Dürr was absolutely right. The evidence as it existed didn't support it. Now, I'll get slightly ahead of the game, but perhaps it's useful to explain this conceptually. As Ehmann understood it, you had the chorus as your point of departure, as your basic unit, and you, what is the word? You subtracted from it. You reduced it to single voices. And as I eventually learned, the chorus was the single voices, and in certain circumstances, you added to it. As I commonly would describe it, it's like in a pop recording, the basic track, singer and guitar, and the overdubs.
Right.
The so-called chorus, which is actually inaccurate, but the more singers are an overdub. So these, I hadn't realized this yet, I mean, I saw things the way everybody saw it. I grew up in that tradition. But in the 70s also, I was assigned by the New Grove Dictionary, which was being created, the standard English language music dictionary. Well, I was asked by the editor, Stanley Sadie, if I would write for them, and asked, what would you like to do for us? I was lucky. Some people sort of thought that I was fairly capable, and Stanley was one of them. So I said, well, you're not going to let me write about Bach. I know that, but I'd love to write. I'd like to write about Schütz. I'd like to do the Schütz article. And I loved Schütz. I loved that music from very early. So I said, I'll do that. They agreed. So one of the things that I figured I had to do when I was working on this article was really do the work list, and these were a very important part of Grove, and which meant looking at just all of the sources of the music, every original printed edition, every manuscript that survived, which I did actually in the space of 3 or 4 years maybe. And of course, when I was looking at them, I was also looking at them with a performer's eye, because I was interested in how you perform this music. So I was, keeping my eyes open for clues on performance. And this is where I got what was the most important piece of information. What I discovered with Schütz was that that singers sang not from vocal scores as they do today, sort of like all 4 voice parts of a normal 4 voice texture with a piano reduction. They sang from individual parts, the way orchestral musicians, chamber musicians still do. So if you have a clarinetist playing from a part, you had a soprano reading and singing from a part. And it was clear that each singer got his own copy of the music. So each soprano got one soprano part. Each tenor got one tenor part. There's really no question about it. It was very simple, black and white. In fact, today, normally 2 singers sing for their own copies of the music. There had been a legend, I can really call it a legend, that with Bach, singers shared their music. They read 3 of them reading from the same music. But so I found this with Schütz, and it was very clear. And of course, the consequences were very obvious. If you have only one copy of a part, there's only one singer. So if you have 4 parts, let's say 1 soprano, 1 alto, 1 tenor, 1 bass, the performance is done by 4 singers, not a modern choir. Obviously, you have to be able to show the relationship, the proportion of singer to part. You have to show that, there weren't many parts that are now lost, etc., etc. But if those things in here, that's what you have. And at the time, of course, I remember thinking, well, that's great. I started looking around the 17th century, same with Monteverdi, same with Buxtehude, blah, 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 blah. And of course, I'm thinking, yes, but when did it change? When did it become what Bach did? When did you have the more people and people sharing their music that you had with Bach? Because I believed it. That's what I was trained to believe. And I still remember that on one afternoon in 1978, see, that I really can still recall, I'm sitting in the Harvard Music Library, which had a special collection of microfilms, a huge collection of microfilms of old manuscripts, printed editions, etc. And they had all of the Bach materials there, all of Bach's manuscripts, etc. I remember rolling through a reel of Bach parts to cantatas, that is, the original parts from which his musicians performed. So not his scores, but, violin one, tenor, organ continua, etc. And I'm reading through this, and I come to one cantata. I can even remember that. It's Die Himmel erzählen die Ehre Gottes. It's BWV 76. And I'm starting to look through it, and I come to the vocal parts, and I see exactly something that I had seen with Schütz. Exactly the same thing. And I said, if this is true, then it's different with Bach, and that the whole thing is different. And at that point, though, I knew that I had to look systematically at all of the parts, which I did over the next 2 years. It was
Wait, so for people who are following you, what is
Yes.
what is the mainstream way of performing a Bach cantata?
Well, the mainstream way has been, since the revival of Bach's music, to have what we call a choir, a chorus, which basically is defined by having multiple singers on each line of the music. Now, when Felix Mendelssohn, in effect, created this, when he created the St. Matthew Passion in 1829, because really Mendelssohn created the Matthew Passion. Bach didn't. Bach just wrote it and performed it in the 18th century, but nobody knew the piece until Mendelssohn makes the present, and he performs it as, of course, you would in those days, with over 150 singers. It's grand, and they didn't think twice about that then. And they needn't have done so. By the way, I have enormous regard for them. That's not the point. And I'm not trying to say that they were dumb. No, quite the contrary. I mean, Mendelssohn is one of the greatest composers, musicians ever to walk down the pike. These are wonderful people. But they set an agenda. Okay. So then in the 20th century, everybody becomes enlightened. And they start to reduce the choir. And by the 1930s, it was pretty much accepted that Bach's choir and performance was 12 singers, 3 sopranos, 3 altos, 3 tenors, 3 basses.
Okay.
And actually, nobody really did this in practice. In practice, let's say people had a chamber choir, which would usually be maybe 30 singers, something like that. And that was considered a good, proper way to do it. So here I come along, and I say, well,
4 people, or
yeah, exactly. We're reducing the choir, but this is ridiculous. But you see, the thing that became clear, that, let's say, after I had gone through all of the parts multiple times, everyone, and really just to see anything that could show the contrary, it was clear that every time you could determine how many singers used a Bach part, the answer was 1. There was simply no exception to this. That's point 1. Secondly, we have most of Bach's parts still, by the way. And almost without exception, you have 1 copy of each voice, 1 soprano part, 1 alto part, 1 tenor part, 1 bass part. And finally, the evidence is overwhelming that there were not more. So, if you have 1 copy of each voice part, if you had already with Bach, 1 copy of each voice part, and 1 singer reading from that music, do the math. It's obvious. It's simple.
what were the common objections that you received to this?
Good question. Gets very slightly ahead of the game, and I'll come to that.
Okay, sure.
Well, okay, I'll put it this way. It looked black and white. And I'm going to jump ahead in one way and say this. Nobody who has gone to the sources, these manuscripts, and studied them with an eye to this problem, has ever come back saying anything different. It's important to say this. So what did happen? Okay. The standard picture of Bach's chorus was actually created in the 1930s, not earlier. And it was created by a German scholar um, on this basis. There is a famous document. It's maybe the most famous of all Bach documents. It's called in German the Entwurf einer wohlbestallten Kirchenmusik. English translation usually reads Draft for a well-appointed church music. It's a memo that he writes to the town council of Leipzig in 1730. And in it, he says at one point, he lists choir sizes, and he does speak of 12 singers at one point. There are some more complications, but he speaks of, let's say, a group of singers that is 3 sopranos, 3 altos, 3 tenors, 3 basses. And this was accepted as the Bach choir. And so in the 1930s, a great Bach scholar by the name of Arnold Schering, who knew the parts and knew their importance, said the following. He said, well, you have one copy of each part. He knew this already. He said, but there are 12 singers. And then he said something very significant. He says, there couldn't be more than 12 singers because only 3 singers can read from the same music. Now, in retrospect, one can notice all of the unsubstantiated assumptions there. How do we know that 3 singers read from the same music? There's no evidence of this. There's no evidence of this ever happening, certainly in the 17th and really in the 18th centuries. If you look at when he says more than cannot, it is clear that to him, a chorus is like a helium balloon. It grows until, it grows bigger or goes higher until something clamps it down, you see, until it runs into some obstacle. So, but this is a conceptual issue that is not easy. And let me be very honest, I didn't understand this all at first either. I could see the facts, I could see the numbers, but putting it all together and making sense of it all was a different matter.
Isn't there, and as a layman, is there any document that says Bach's church employs 20 people? These are the singers, and so there's no document like that.
There is no document like that, but since you raise it, there is another danger with documents like that. Let's say that there is a document that says, and we actually have something like that in the Weimar period of Bach, that says, okay, there are 20 singers employed by the church. Let's say that we're not talking choirs, but we're talking baseball teams or American football. American football team has 45 players. Now, we all know that 45 players do not take the field all at once. A European football team, a soccer team, has maybe 4 goalkeepers on its books. They do not all go onto the field at once. So the question is, what do these numbers mean? And again, unconsciously, people tend to see a number like that and think, oh, that's how many perform all the time. By the way, the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra has about 150 members. They never play at once. It's a pool from which people are drawn. Now,
so I'm sorry, Joshua. I think it was mentioned that, but look at these paintings of people looking at the same sheet. So therefore, it has to be 3 or 2 people.
Yeah. Well, my dear friend and colleague Andrew Parrott has pointed out that pictorial evidence has a way of dematerializing. These paintings don't really, one could go through all of them, but let me say this, that you see, all of these points really are missing the point. The first thing to do is go to look at the parts. I could perfectly well be wrong. I could perfectly well be wrong in saying these are A, the strongest evidence that we have, and B, this is what the evidence shows. Fine. What's interesting is that nobody has done that. Nobody has gone to look at them. And those that have gone to look have all come out saying, oh, but it's exactly what you say there. I could name names, but that's not the point. The question then is, okay, what is the response? What are the arguments? Well, the response was basically, well, what about? Now, of course, and even the point you raise about the pictures. Well, yeah, whataboutism is unknown,
What about this?
but it's something we have to deal with. There's no question. And of course, I had to consider all of that. And I can
Mm,
just tell you that the document with the 12 singers, etc., isn't saying anything of the sort. Bach is talking about singers needed to cover the liturgical demands throughout an entire year. You get one clue about this, for example, that where he mentions really 12 singers, he says, you have to have 12 singers. And he says, and there, by the way, there are a number of choirs in Leipzig. It's not just one group. There are a bunch of boys at the Thomasschule. And by the way, boys includes young men of 20, 21, 22. It's not
mm,
just, boys as we would think of it now. But there were 55 of them in Bach's day, and they have to provide music at 4 different churches.
mm,
And not all of them are even capable of singing well. So you can see that there are certain numerical limitations there. But the point is that sorry, no, I lost a bit of the thread there. Forgive me. They are the ones who will sing, and so one has. Yes, sorry. What Bach says was this. He said, in the choirs that sing more than simple chorales, not necessarily cantatas, you have to have at least 12 singers. But then he said, but why? He says, well, because so if one of them gets sick, which often happens at this time of year, you can at least do a double choir motet. That is 8 voices, and how many singers on each voice? 1. In other words, he's talking about the
mm.
total forces you need to carry
The
out.
full football team.
It's the full football team. As I say,
Yeah,
it's the squad, not the lineup.
right.
So these documents say nothing about the lineup. If you want to know what the lineup is, you have to go to the parts. These are what the people sang from. And as I say, the parts leave really no possible doubt. Or if there is a possible doubt, I'm the first who's been waiting to see it.
Mm,
Now, I can tell you, and I know this may not sound plausible, one would have to do quite a bit of digging through a quite extensive literature to verify this. But you will find that all of those who attack this never say anything about the parts. They simply say, well, Bach said 12 singers, that's the end of the story.
mm,
Now, I even wrote a little book on this business of this document because you have to. So, and I said there, well, look, let's try to read this carefully. For one thing, I have to say, Bach's language is not modern German. I'm fortunate that through the work I did on Schütz and other things, I'm pretty adept at 17th and 18th century German.
mm.
And even, German scholars say to me straight out, yeah, this is not stuff that people understand now. So if you read what he writes carefully, all I can say is that it doesn't say what people say it says. And again, I've set forth arguments there, and it's perfectly legitimate for anybody to come forth and say, well, you've misread this, and here is why the traditional understanding of this document is really the preferable one.
Mm.
But again, interestingly, nobody has done that.
I had a question, which is, could he have written
Mhm.
in mind for a large choir, and has he done that, or does this apply to all his vocal music?
Okay. First of all, he never did it. He never wrote for, so far as we can tell, more than, let's say, 2 choirs, each of 4 voices, total of 8. And sometimes they sing, in certain pieces, they sing in unison.
Mm.
So that's basically the maximum. Now, well, as for the other side of the question, what did he wish for? Well, I mean, it's obvious. Bach always wanted the modern piano. He always wanted the modern orchestra with valve trumpets and valve horns. He always wanted steel strings, etc., etc., etc. I mean, we know such things, and you laugh at this because you're familiar with it in these other places. But no,
How
there's
would
no.
you have reacted to the 20th century recordings of 20 people in each part?
Well, possibly he loved it. He would have loved it. Possibly he would have hated it. We have no way of knowing.
Mm.
But I can cite a couple of things here that first of all, I wouldn't do this as a performer. I mean, look, my job isn't
I'm
finding.
very curious now about how that would sound. It sounds
Yeah,
very good.
well, oh, come on, you have it all over the place. You have the Thomanerchor in Leipzig with 100 people with old instruments. I mean, frankly, I'm very tolerant. I'm very pluralistic, but that is crap. I mean, that is fake. This that you have the combination of the modern choir and instruments with which never perform together, and people sell that as authentic, etc. No, that's the one place I'll draw the line. But in the scholarly sense, in the research sense, I'm not interested in what Bach wanted because, frankly, there isn't evidence on this. I mean, when there's evidence of what a composer wanted, obviously we take it seriously, but we have no explicit evidence of what Bach wanted. We only have evidence of what he did. As a performer, I follow this not out of piety, but because, frankly, I think the music sounds much better that way. I think.
Yes, I'm interested in here.
I am
Can you
pretty-
recommend a recording that people could first go to hear this done well?
Well, some of mine are really not so bad. Quite a few recordings of mine. I don't think they're all wonderful, but some of them, I think Wachet auf, ruft uns die Stimme, BWV 140 is really pretty good. The old B minor Mass for Nonesuch still holds up, I find, fairly well. You can get a sense of what it sounds like. But like it or not, to me, as a performing musician, the music is much more beautiful. In fact, I can even recall Sigiswald Kaukin, who's one of the first European heavies to take this on board, saying to me when we first met in Leipzig, we're talking with each other. I like and admire Sigiswald a great deal. At one point he said, but the real reason to do it is that it sounds so much more beautiful. And I'm totally in agreement with
Yes,
him.
thank you. That's the right attitude.
It's the right attitude in performance. The research, the scholarship has to be solid. I mean, this is not just you're doing what you like. But as
it just happens to be the same thing, though.
Well, I think so. I like to think so. But I can, in fact, show you a couple of things or mention a couple of things that I think show that Bach, whatever he, quote, wanted, unquote, composed for this medium. You take the opening chorus of the St. Matthew Passion, where there is no question that there were 8 singers performing this, plus a 9th singer doing the soprano and the piano. Not the huge boys' choir, but one singer was a boy. But that throughout the movement, the singers of choir 1 and choir 2 are sort of calling back and forth to each other. Now, at a certain point near the end, the 2 choirs suddenly join in unison. Now, I can remember still conducting the first rehearsal of this movement in 1985, the first performance we did of the Matthew Passion, according to what the parts told us. And I'm conducting away in the rehearsal. And, I know the score, and I've read the score, and I've seen that the voices come together there, but, okay, so Bach's making it easy for himself. He doesn't want to write in 8 real parts there. He'll do it in 4, etc., 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 So I'm conducting away, and I do the cue at that spot, and I almost fall down, just, like hit by a thunderbolt, when I hear that sound of the second choir joining the first. And this very different sonority of 2 singers singing the same music, 2 widely spaced singers. It was tremendously dramatic. And at that point, I was so struck by this. And of course, in thinking about it, I have to say, look, I think one has to accept that Bach planned this, that he meant this as a dramatic climax of this movement, and that if you perform that movement in the modern style with multiple voices, that effect just is lost. See, I'd
Mm.
never noticed it because I'd grown up with traditional performances. So here, I think I do have, I can cite, and I can cite many more examples where I think if you perform it in a modern way, you're going to lose something very essential to the music that I think we have to believe that Bach intended and planned. So that I know is subject to discussion, to debate. It's something that's inferred from the musical texts themselves. But again, I would have to say those who are opposed to it, well, deal with it and start arguing the matter. After 40 years now, I don't expect anybody to argue it. And I certainly, in a way, have
It
grown
sounds
tired.
so compelling. It sounds so
No,
compelling.
no, I'm very pleased by that. But, for all we know, it could be, well, as a matter of fact, a very, very prominent musician. Oh, I'm not going to protect the guilty. Gustav Leonhardt once
Yes.
said, "It sounds beautiful, but it is wrong, and I can prove it." Yeah. He said, "It is wrong, and I can prove it." I go now. I was curious, and some years later I met Leonhardt, by the
Mm.
way, and I said to him, I'm curious about this because you said you can prove it. So obviously, I'm interested in anything that can prove me wrong. And do you have some evidence that and honest to God, he said to me, "Oh no, I don't have any different evidence. I just read it differently from you."
Wow.
Now, I'll have to say that is, forgive this word, unethical and fake. And I lost a lot of respect for Leonhardt in that
And
exchange.
really a huge respected figure in early
Yeah.
music, and
Well,
but
not so fast in every way. Leonhardt's a complicated character. I mean, I respect him enormously as a musician. I never cared for his music making particularly, but I always had great respect for it, and I still do. But those in
he
Holland.
had to admit that it was beautiful. He had to admit that.
Yes, I'm pleased that he did admit that it was beautiful. But as I say, um, this that somehow his opinion is the truth. Well, he traded on that a lot. Leonhardt traded on an authority that was
That
in large
famous quote that
measure.
he is considered the pope of harpsichordists or something like that.
Yeah, well, he played on that. I mean, he didn't create it, I'm sure, but in a way, he created it by adopting this particular high ascetic attitude, etc., which was not totally the truth of his life. Um, but again, okay, he's human. I'm not here to knock Leonhardt, as I say, for whom I do have a
Mhm.
great deal of respect.
Right.
It's just that life is
Yeah, I would have
complicated. And I suppose we could
if
also
he had
say,
provided some evidence, that would have been a good sort of discussion, I think.
if he had the evidence, I would have loved to have seen it,
Mm.
or if he could even defend how he read it. But to say, I can prove it, no, that just doesn't go. I will say one thing about that occurs to me. There is something about this issue that has a lot of people, let's say, performing beneath their level. Um, you know,
Ah,
it's not worthy of a Leonhardt to adopt a ploy like that. It's not worthy of certain other scholars, I know. Um, and it, but let me try to put a positive spin on it. I mean, have I suffered for this? Oh boy, yes. Just for the very simple fact that I lost a lot of work. I mean, Andrew Parrott has experienced the same thing.
mm,
Sigismund Kauken has experienced the same thing, although he has done better in part because of where he was, etc., etc. But
mm.
none of us have had it easy who've made the switch, as it were. But people clearly have a very, very, very vested interest in maintaining what had been a status quo. But the vested interest comes, I think, from a genuine love of this music and identification with this music. When there were very vociferous reactions against this, when I first had the temerity to present it publicly, I said sometimes, look, it's like being told that that what? The flag is in tatters. Apple pie will give you ptomaine poisoning. And I mean, mom, the flag and apple pie, the great things.
It's
And
beyond the pale, essentially.
yeah, people were offended by it. And as I say, look at it, it doesn't excuse it all, but it also has its roots in, I think, genuine passion for this music,
Mm.
love of this music, and identification for this music, with this music. And if you are being told that what you had identified with was not true, you take that personally in many ways.
So wait, okay, this is mind-blowing. So what before is all vocal music like this? And when does it suddenly become a big chorus?
That's a very good question also. Okay, to oversimplify, all vocal music before the late 18th century is fundamentally one to a part. Fundamentally. Now, as I say, that's oversimplifying. But so oversimplifying, the chorus as we understand it as a performing entity doesn't exist. Okay. Now, when does it change? Well, it's like Hemingway's going bankrupt, very gradually and then suddenly. It's really the late 18th century that's the key here. First of all, the amateur choir is born in Berlin at the Singakademie, where you have people getting together to sing older music and larger numbers of people. Now, there had always been a possibility of amplifying your basic chorus of single voices. And it was done. In other words, the way it was done, that let's say you had, 5-voice piece, and 5 voices, let's say 2 sopranos, an alto, tenor, bass, were the choir. But you could, under certain circumstances, set up a second choir that would sing the same music. So it would be in unison with your first 5 voices. Unlike modern practice, these singers did not stand together with the first 5. They were separately stationed. But that is an option that you can do. That's an overdub that you can do, okay? So it was mostly not done, and most of the time when it's done, it's something that the composer specified, although very often specified as an option, not as something obligatory. But you have that. Okay, so you have the possibility. Maybe this is like, I know the secondhand, like the 2 versions of Taylor Swift's albums, There's the more naked version and there's the more produced version. Certain Beatles songs have, So this is, I think, maybe not a useless thing to keep in mind about that. Now, in the later 18th century, you start to get, as I say, the amateur choir, where you have multiple members, and there was this practice this possible practice of doubling up, of adding more singers. And we know that in the Berlin Singakademie, they did this. And they sometimes did it using Bach's own parts, but they copied out extra parts. And as one friend of mine, a great German musicologist named Ludwig Fincher, sadly also no longer among us, said, these people paid membership fees. They felt they had a right to sing. So this is the growth of the communal experience. I mean, that's a very wonderful thing. It's something,
Yes.
that I respect a great deal. But so they sing this. Then you do have larger things happening. For example, in London in 1784, there's a performance of Messiah at Westminster Abbey with about 400 singers. In Vienna, less known, at the same time in the 70s, there are performances of excerpts from Handel oratorios with, what did they excerpt? What they do? Basically, the choruses, the only thing in which anybody was interested. The only thing in which anybody's interested today. You suffer through the recits and the arias to get to the choruses. And the choruses were sung by about 40 singers. So you have this sort of growth of choral forces. Now, Bach is not in the picture here. But in the late 18th century, for example, he starts to come in the picture. So a famous German music aesthetician, Johann Friedrich Reichhardt, writes, if I recall, Bach composes choruses that are every bit as grand as Handel's. Well, the jig is almost up right there. Then the Singakade comes along, Mendelssohn comes along,
Right.
and so again, I can point to one other neat example, which is going to make you laugh, and that it would make you laugh is in fact symptomatic, and that's this: there is a cantata by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, Auferstehung und Himmelfahrt Jesu. So, resurrection and ascension of Jesus, and he performed it with 8 singers, by the way. The choruses have 8 singers in all in his performances. But there's a great bass aria in it with trumpets and horns and drums, so a really big noise in the orchestra. And in 1836, I think it is, a great German scholar named Karl von Winterfeld writes about this oratorio, this cantata. People thought it was an oratorio. It's not. It's C.P. Bach was very specific that it's a cantata, but he writes about this aria, and he says, "Now this is a great, great aria." He said, "But if it's to have its intended effect, it can't be sung by only one bass. You have to."
Okay.
I think he said something like a veritable phalanx of basses. Now, you see, we think that's silly now, right? We're more enlightened than that. We know that an aria is only one bass.
Yeah.
Well, but not so fast. See,
Yeah.
we know that a chorus is such and such a number of singers. Well, maybe not.
Incredible, incredible. Well, what can I say? I mean, I I might have to change my whole listening library now, so just because of this. So this is interesting. I mean, I thank you for that, for at least to give this perspective that I think a lot of people will be certainly very intrigued by. And Joshua, I want to leave on one very quick thing,
Please.
which
And
is,
I'm sorry that my answers are not always so quick.
no, this has been fantastic. And
Okay.
I mentioned in passing at the beginning of the interview about a rise in traditionalism in terms of certain things in music.
Right.
And I'm really, we have been exploring pedagogy particularly.
Right.
And have you ever heard about partimento or something to do with this sort really a basso continuo, figured bass, thorough bass, general bass? And what do you make of it? Give just your reaction to it, essentially.
Well, I do know partimento, although I'm not expert in it. And I've seen that on previous occasions. You've had some partimento experts on, including, is it Sanguinetti?
Yes.
Yes, whom I've met also and shared a wonderful lunch in Belgium many years ago. Admire him a great deal. The partimento is fascinating stuff. And it offers a lot of insights into a lot of things. In terms of continuo practice, that is actually playing from the figures, I'm not sure that it really has that many implications, because it's really a matter of sort of creating a kind of polyphony from the figures. And I know this opens up a whole nother can of worms, but basically, I'm of the view that in, let's say, 99% of the occasions, continuo is something that is felt but not heard. Its job is really to be behind the other instruments and just help knit them together. The minute, I'll say this slightly exaggerated, the minute in an ensemble performance you really notice the continuo, they're doing it wrong. And partimento is not really part of continuo practice. What they share is figures, of course, and working from figures. But again, to come back to partimento, I think it's a fascinating thing. I like everything that I know about it. I may draw different inferences from it, from what others might, or I might not draw the inferences from it that some might draw. But that doesn't at all diminish, I think, the interest of it and the importance of it, because it does give us a lot of insight into the way people are conceptualizing music and conceptualizing music pedagogy.
Well, the great Professor Joshua Rifkin. I mean, really been what a tremendous conversation. It's been such a I could just sit here listening to you talk about anything really. We didn't get a chance to talk about Josquin and Schutz really too much, but let's say that for another episode. And I just really thank you so much for coming on the show, sir. So let's come back on again in the future, and I hope you had a good time as well.
Well, I'm delighted to have been here. I really am grateful to you for inviting me and for really posing very, very interesting and often challenging questions. So I too look forward to more of the same when the appropriate moment arises. And meanwhile, thank you very much for this.